This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet on Kaurna land and we wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship that the Kaurna people have with their traditional land. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia and UCL to hear Professor Geraldine, Gerry, Thomas, speak about radiation health, risks from nuclear accidents, facts and fantasy. The University of South Australia is pleased to be co-presenting this event with UCL Australia, and we thank the team for all their support. Professor Thomas is also in Adelaide as part of the National Conference of the Australasian Radiation Protection Society, and we acknowledge their support as well. The Hawke Centre is committed to delivering a diverse and free program of events and exhibitions throughout the year, and that's based on our fundamental themes of strengthening our democracy, valuing our diversity and building our future. So just a quick introduction on Gerry. So Gerry emphasises the prevalence of misconceptions related to radiological risk as well as the range of factors that can influence both dose and exposure to radiation. Gerry is a senior academic at the Faculty of Medicine, Department of Surgery and Cancer at the Imperial College London, where she is an active researcher in fields of tissue banking and molecular pathology of thyroid and breast cancer. Gerry is a strong believer that public involvement and information is a key part of academic research and is actively involved in the public communication of research, particularly with respect to radiation protection and biobanking. Gerry has written numerous editorial pieces and provided comment to the media following the Fukushima nuclear disaster. In 2015, she appeared in the TV documentary series Uranium, Twisting the Dragon's Tail, and was called to appear before the Nuclear Fuel Cycle Royal Commission in South Australia in October last year to answer the Commission's questions regarding the effects and threats of radiation. Gerry is also a member of the UCL Australia's Nuclear Working Group. So in that, please join me in welcoming Gerry to the lectern. Thank you, Gerry.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much to UCL for inviting me to do this. For those of you who don't know, Imperial College and UCL are somewhat at daggers drawn in London, so it's quite nice to be invited by our rivals. If I want Imperial to do something, I just have to say, well, UCL are doing it already, and they go, okay, fine, we'll do it. Okay, I suspect what I'm going to say will surprise some of you today, at least, but I'm hoping to give you some form of perspective on the health effects of radiation, particularly low-dose radiation. Now, unfortunately, we have quite a lot of myths surrounding radiation. You're all aware, of course, that Spider-Man was bitten by a radioactive spider. And I spend an awful lot of my time when we have the Imperial Festival in Imperial talking to children about how they cannot get superpowers from being bitten by radioactive spiders. They're far more interested in that than anything else I've got to say. And of course, who wouldn't trust this man's father to run a nuclear power station? Obviously, you know that you're going to get three-eyed fish coming from the nuclear ponds if you were allowed to fish in them. We have a problem there because, unfortunately, most of us probably rely far more on the fiction than the facts when we talk about radiation. Hopefully, what I'm going to say will address some of those today. We have a problem with radiation. We have a very long history of being made to fear radiation. I'm a child born in the 60s, and I can remember all of the films that we used to see that gave the impression if there was another nuclear attack, that would finish our species on this planet. It probably suited most of our governments to actually let us be frightened of radiation at that point because it made a good way of making us quite happy that they were spending so much money on atomic weapons. There's a general acceptance of medical radiation exposure and exposure to natural radiation. And it's interesting to me that the two cultures that actually probably are most fearful of radiation at low doses are the Japanese and the Germans. And they love sitting in radioactive spas because they feel that man-made radiation is better for them. It's interesting, even in Japan, it always amazes me, that they actually advertise that the fact they will pump in more radon, which we know gives you lung cancer, into their spas to make them more healthy. It just seems a bit counterintuitive to me. Now, there is a relationship between dose and response to all toxins. I'm originally a pharmacologist, so I really get this. If you have a higher dose of something, it is going to have more of an effect on your health than if you have a lower dose. And radiation is no different. We tend to think that radiation is something special. Your body just sees it as a toxin. So in other respects, it's not that different from things like chemicals and drugs and things that we're more familiar with. The individual dose from radiation in the environment, and we'll go on to talk a bit more about this in a minute, depends on many different factors. So it isn't as simple as popping a pill. There are many different things in the environment that can affect the dose that you actually receive. There is also a perception that individual dose from nuclear accidents is much, much higher than it actually is. And as dose is related to effect, if you don't understand the fact that the dose is very much lower than perhaps you realise, then you're going to expect there to be much bigger effects. So you can see why there's so much confusion around the effects of radiation. Okay. Now, we have a problem with risk communication. And this was particularly apparent following the events in Japan in 2011. There is far too much jargon. I mean, scientists use jargon the whole time. We can't help it. It's sort of hardwired into us. But we have a problem in that we use so many different terms to describe radioactivity and radiation dose that actually it becomes very confusing to the general population. Now, there are good reasons why we do that scientifically, but it doesn't help us explain to the general public. We'll come on to some of those in a minute. Also, radioactivity is a political football. The nuclear industry is a very political issue. It divides opinions in society quite radically. There is a huge amount of misinformation and very little understandable science that's out there for people to read. So we really are making a rod for our own back because we haven't been able to communicate in this area effectively. Part of that is due to the fact that scientists like to have lots and lots of data before they say we have a definitive answer. And for the health effects of radiation, that means several years' worth of data. So while we're hanging back and not interpreting the data for people because we want to see all the data together, you'll find others that will interpret that data and, quite frankly, misinterpret that data. And so you get entrenched views already coming to the fore, and we're permanently on the back foot trying to say, well, no, the data doesn't say that. And the nuclear industry is not our best friend in all of this. We constantly emphasize safety in the nuclear industry. Now, I work in the medical side of things, and if I said to you, actually, your operation isn't very safe, let's go through the reasons why it's not safe, you probably would never sign that consent form. So it's interesting that for something that I regard as far more risky, which is a surgeon operating on very delicate bits of your body, okay, he's very well trained, or she is very well trained, but there's still an element of risk undertaking that. And we don't go through and emphasize that risk in the same way that we do in terms of the nuclear area. And I've been to many meetings with the nuclear bodies and regulators and things like that, and they have, let's have 2 minutes while we think about the safety. If I started every single MDT where we discussed patients and their treatment with, let's have 2 minutes while we think about safety, I think we would probably have a very different attitude to life. So really, they don't help us because immediately we hear, you're talking about safety, it means that we think, so it's not safe then, is it? You're not telling us the whole thing, it's not safe. And this was probably best, the evidence I have for this is a friend of mine who actually works in PR for one of the National Nuclear Laboratory in the UK, got on a flight to go to Japan, the first time he'd been to Japan, sitting waiting to take off. And the pilot came out on the radio and said, just to let you know, we're going to fly a slightly different route than we would normally, just a little bit further down from the pole than normal, because it's going to be a bit safer. And he sat there thinking, hang on, I didn't know this was an unsafe thing for me to be doing. And, immediately you start thinking, I have heard the word safer, therefore what they were doing before was not safe. I wasn't aware there was somebody calculating how dangerous this journey I'm going on is going to be. So we have problems there. There's also a huge image problem with nuclear power, and this is a Ipsos Mori poll that was carried out in 23 countries, so it's not defined by one country. This is a universal issue, and most people worry about radiation and its impact on health, and the possibility of disaster. And there's another word there that I take issue with. Disaster. Accident, yes. Disaster, we turn it into the disaster by our actions. It's an accident that actually happens. And it's also interesting to look at the use of English around this sort of subject and to see how that might influence how people feel. So let's be clear what we're talking about to start off with. You have a spectrum of different energies that you're exposed to. I hope you all put on suntan lotion when you go out into the sun. I'm sure you do in Australia. We don't do very well in the UK with that, because of course we know that UV causes melanoma, which is a cancer that will kill you. But what we're talking about here is the high-frequency radiation, the ionizing radiation, okay? We're not talking about any of the rest. Okay, the one thing that we need to know from the start is that you're all surrounded by radiation. You can't avoid it. It is in your daily life, whether you like it or not. Of course, you know you're going to be irradiated if you go through a CT scanner. But did you know that there's radiation in your food? And Brazil nuts and bananas are particularly good for you, nutritionally. They also have quite a lot of potassium-40, which is a radioactive nuclide in them. And of course, when you go to the dentist, you have dental x-rays. And what many people don't realize is every time you take a transatlantic flight or intercontinental flight, which for Australians might be a bit of an issue because you really do have to do that. You just can't get off the island otherwise. You are exposed to radiation, cosmic radiation, and you can't avoid it. But of course, what most people worry about are the effects of atomic bombs. And you'll notice this is American personnel here, nicely lined up, watching one of the explosions in the Nevada desert. I don't think we'd be encouraging them to do that anymore like that now. And the accidents at nuclear power stations, this, of course, is Chernobyl. So we are exposed to radiation the whole time, and how much varies on where you are on this planet. It varies on a number of things, but actually what we worry about is actually confined to about 1% of what makes up our natural background dose. So the vast majority of the dose comes from radon gas from the ground, and I got into a lot of trouble when I started talking about Fukushima, because I kept saying, actually the doses are lower than you get in Cornwall. Cornish Tourist Board were not very happy with me. But it's true. And in fact, one of my friends who works at the British Embassy has actually taken readings around the Tohoku area in the Fukushima prefecture, and actually his background level when he goes home to Aberdeen is much higher than the levels up there. So it just shows you how much it does vary around the world. So you can't avoid this. You take some in your food. About 15% of our annual doses, and it will depend on what procedures you've had during the year, comes from medical radiation, and 1% comes from artificial. And you can see the very small percentages that we're talking about of our actual annual dose from nuclear accidents and fallout, etc. Now, this is a good exercise to do with children in school, because it gives you 2 teaching points with one slide. What I asked them to do, this is actually on the University of Sydney website. This is a dose calculator, and it shows you all the things that can influence your radioactive dose each year. The units here are microsievert, so they're very tiny. But how high you are above sea level. I've put 16 hours in there. I've probably spent a damn sight more than 16 hours on planes this year, just to give myself a dose of 85. If you look at radiation in soil and rocks, the type of thing that you build your house with can also affect your radiation dose. And here you have food, water, and air, which is actually quite a large contributor. And the fallout from nuclear weapons tests is much, much lower. Now, the next one's quite interesting because people go, nah, that can't be right. But if you live within 80 kilometers of a coal-fired plant, your dose is actually 3 times higher than if you live within 80 kilometers of a nuclear power plant, okay, in normal operations. And that's simply because when you burn coal, you actually allow the radionuclides that are present in that coal to be released into the atmosphere. Another good reason for getting rid of coal-fired power stations, but we'll come on to those again in a minute. Of course, if you sleep with somebody regularly, that also increases your dose. I've been trying that one with my husband for a long while, but he hasn't quite got the message yet. The best one of all, though, is to explain to children in particular that smoking substantially increases the dose of radiation your lungs receive each year. So if you have a pack of cigarettes a year, it will depend on the type of cigarettes, but it gives you a dose of between 10 and 13 millisieverts per year if you smoke 1 pack per day for a whole year. And that is actually caused by polonium-210, which, if those of you who remembered the attack we had on Alexander Litvinenko in London, polonium-210 is the thing that killed him. And we could trace polonium-210 quite easily around London, and nobody was worried about it, because it was those nasty Russians. It wasn't something man-made. So there we are. Smoking is not good for you, but interestingly, it's not the content that is radioactive that gives you the lung cancers. There are 50 other nasty carcinogens which are far more effective at giving you lung cancer. So don't smoke. If you want to go and play with that, it's freely available on the website, or at least it was the last time I looked. The other thing we forget about is, of course, this being exposed to radiation is not new. Most of us worry about the nuclear power plant accidents in Chernobyl and Fukushima. We actually have quite short memories when it comes to radiation exposure. You're a slightly older audience than the ones I normally more mature audience than the ones that I normally deal with. So most kids are blissfully unaware of above-ground testing that went on in the 1960s. I think you're probably slightly more aware of it than most audiences will be. But actually, there was an awful lot of iodine and cesium release. Now, the iodine, by the time it hits the ground, will have substantially decayed. But the cesium won't. But if you compare the amounts of cesium compared with these 2 nuclear power plant accidents that we worry about, it actually pales into insignificance. And a lot of this came across on a westerly airflow from the United States to the UK, and I have to be careful, it wasn't really the Americans' fault, because some of them were our bombs they were testing. They get very upset when I just blame them for everything. But actually, there are still data available that you can plot graphs to see how much cesium and strontium was in our milk in the 1960s, compared with that from the Chernobyl accident in the 1980s. And it is a huge difference. Not that the doses we actually got were that high, and I'll come on to explain that in a minute. But we have very short memories. And you'll hear people talk about the Sami people who live in the Nordic countries, who are reindeer hunters. They live on reindeer meat. That's all they've got to eat, basically. And cesium gets concentrated in the lichen. And in actual fact, the doses that the Sami people had in the 1960s from cesium from fallout was much higher than they had from the 1980s from Chernobyl. And there's good documentary evidence for that. And incidentally, also in Japan, because this was above-ground testing, it went right the way across the northern hemisphere. Okay, so we need to understand what the likely effects of radiation on our health is going to be. So we need to have some studies. Otherwise, if we don't collect data and do proper studies, we can't properly assess what's due to radiation and what's due to everything else. So we get our data from a series of different sources. We get it from the atomic bombings in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. We get it from Chernobyl. We aren't getting very much from Fukushima, and I'll explain why at the end, because actually there were very few health effects from radiation from Fukushima. But also, we get it from populations that are exposed to much higher levels than most of us are as well. And there are a number of those around the world. Places in Brazil, places in Iran, around Ramsar, have the highest natural background radiation anywhere in the world. And some places in China as well, so quite high. And also, we get a lot of data from cohorts of people who've worked in the nuclear industry, whether that be in mining or whether that be in running nuclear power plants, running the reprocessing plant at Sellafield and things like that. And of course from medical technologists as well, because they're also exposed to a small amount of radiation. Now the problem that we have is all radiation is not equal. It's not like a paracetamol or something like that. There are different types of radiation, and they have different energies, and that dictates how far they can penetrate. Now, radiation will only do damage to your tissues if it comes into contact with them. So it's got to get into your internal workings to be able to cause some of its problems. So this is a famous practical that we used to all do in school, but now we're not allowed to do it any longer. But it was a really good visual way of showing how different sources of radiation can penetrate differently. So things like gamma radiation, they're a waveform, they have no charge. They just go straight through, and they'll go straight through until they get stopped by something like concrete. Now you might think that would make them extremely dangerous. Actually, an awful lot of your body is space. I keep telling myself that it's not fat, it's space, okay? An awful lot of your body is space. And those waves will pass straight through your body without interacting with anything. Difficult to imagine, but think having an X-ray. We have an X-ray because it goes through your body, okay? Now, people worry about alpha and beta, but actually these are both charged particles, one's positive, one's negative, and these can be stopped quite easily. Now, alpha particles are actually a helium nucleus, so they're quite big, okay, and they have a positive charge. And you can actually stop alpha particles by just putting a piece of paper in front of them. That's all you need to stop them. Your skin acts as an extremely good barrier to alpha particles. The only problem is when you ingest them or inhale them. Okay? So if you smoke, polonium-210 is a classic, only emits alpha. If you take that in and inhale the smoke into your lungs, obviously you're going to get a dose to your lungs. Beta particles, they're electrons basically ejected from the nucleus, and they have different levels of energy. So you can't even say all beta particles are the same, they're not. It depends on which isotope they come from. Perhaps you start to see why now it's incredibly difficult to talk about this to people, because it's bad enough for us to try and get our heads around it. But basically what I want you to remember is to damage cellular structures inside the body, which are the bits we're interested in for causing cancer and damage, etc. Isotopes that emit alpha and beta have to get inside you, so they have to be inhaled or ingested. So if you can stop that inhalation or stop taking them in contaminated food, you protect people from the effects of that radiation. Okay, so that's the basics. Now we get on to the even more complicated stuff. Your health effects are affected by the dose, okay? And the individual dose depends on an awful lot of different things. When you're dealing with volatile isotopes, things that are blown around in the wind, obviously the wind direction makes quite a difference. And this is just a map of how variable the wind was in the first 6 days after the Chernobyl explosions. So you can see that the first 3 days, which is probably when most radiation was being released, is actually over southern Belarus. But then the wind swung south and came over northern Ukraine. So the way the wind is blowing and blowing that airborne radiation around is extremely important when you're trying to work out what doses people might have had. Where you live also makes a very big difference, and that's partly because what you eat also depends on where you live. So if you live in a rural environment, you're probably going to be growing your own crops, and you're probably going to be out in the countryside a lot more than if you live in the city, where we spend most of our time inside in nice air-conditioned rooms if it's warm as well, because the weather also makes a difference. If it's cold, most people like to be sheltering inside their houses when the radioactive cloud comes over. If it's hot, they like to be outside. And also affects the way that your economy is run and the way your food gets to you. So most of us think we have fresh milk from the nice convenience stores down the road. Actually, most of it is at least a week old by the time it gets to us, because the lorry goes to the farm, collects the milk, takes it off to a creamery, pasteurizes it, comes back, sits in the shop, and then we buy it. So if you have something that has a short physical half-life, a lot of that will have decayed by the time we get around to drinking it. If you have your own backyard cow where you go out, pump the tail, take the milk out, you're going to get a significantly higher dose, because it will have eaten contaminated grass, converted that straight into milk, and you'll be drinking the milk the next morning, fresh from the cow. Also, a lot of rural areas, particularly in somewhere like Sweden or in Belarus, actually eat an awful lot of field mushrooms. They go out into the forests at the weekend and they collect mushrooms and they use it as a meat substitute. And if you go down some of the routes that come down from the forests around Minsk, which is the capital city of Belarus, you'll find people sitting there selling loads of mushrooms. Now, mushrooms concentrate cesium, so if there's any radioactive cesium around, they will concentrate it. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you can't eat them, but the advice that was given to the Swedes following the Chernobyl accident was don't eat any more than 1 kilo of mushrooms a week. Have you seen how much 1 kilo of mushrooms is? You have to like mushrooms a lot, really, to want to eat that sort of amount. But so the type of diet you're on. And in Japan, for example, they have an awful lot of seaweed in their diet. They have an awful lot of iodine, natural iodine in their diet. So their thyroids are awash with iodine. So their glands won't take up as much radioactive iodine, because there's enough space for it to get into, as somebody more like the people around Chernobyl who had little iodine in their diet, miles from the nearest sea, didn't eat much green vegetables and things. So your diet is also key in understanding this. Then we come on to the tougher bit, physics. Now, most of us hate physics, let's be quite honest. But physics is really, really important. The physical half-life, how long it takes a certain amount of this material to decay by half, is extremely important. We tend to think that long-lived isotopes are very dangerous. Actually, if something's long-lived, it means it's extremely boring. Most of the time, it's sitting there and it does nothing. It doesn't give off its radiation quickly. It's a bit like looking at a glowing splint. But we have in our minds an idea that if something is around for longer, it's far more dangerous. Actually, it's the reverse. Chemistry. Now, your bodies are designed to take up certain elements that are rare in the environment and hold on to them because you need them for certain purposes in your body. Iodine's a really good example of this. Iodine is normally quite scarce in our environment unless you happen to be eating loads of fish and seaweed off the coast of Japan. So our thyroids have developed a way of concentrating the iodine by pumping it into the gland, and then they bind it to keep it there because they don't know when the next iodine is coming in. And that means that you can effectively run your body because your thyroid gland actually controls all of your metabolism. So the chemistry, how soluble something is, uranium, for example, is not soluble unless it's in an organic form, so you take it in and most of it goes straight through you. Also has a long radioactive life, so it doesn't emit radiation very often. So you have a lower dose from things like that. But things that get concentrated in your body may give you a higher dose, because the next problem we have is biology. So not only do we have a physical half-life to consider, we also have a biological half-life. When you take a substance into your body, over time, it gets metabolized and replaced, or just naturally replaced, not even metabolized. And we know that happens because of drugs. If you think about it, you have to take your drugs every morning. Otherwise, if you don't, your plasma levels drop. And that's because your drugs are being excreted over time. And it's the same for isotopes that you take in. So some things have a longer biological half-life than they do physical half-life. Now, they're the ones that are slightly more concerned to us. So iodine has a half-life of 8 days, physical half-life of 8 days, but your body keeps the iodine in there for 100 days. So there's a good chance it's actually going to release its radiation while it's inside you. Cesium is the opposite. Cesium concentrates nowhere in your body. It's spread all over the place. But it has a half-life also of about 100 days in biological terms. But cesium-137, which is the one we tend to be most concerned about when we talk about nuclear accidents, has a physical half-life of 30 years. So the chances of the radiation being released while it's in you are much, much lower than it is with iodine. So you get a lower dose from that. It gets worse, however, because actually the chances of getting cancer from exposure to radiation is all based on probability. So hopefully you now begin to know why I'm grey. Trying to bring all of this together and communicate about it, about how complicated things around radiation is extremely difficult. Most of us, if we're honest in this room, will struggle with one science. We're having to struggle with 3 sciences and maths as well. So it's not very easy to understand and to explain. And the dosimetrists are great. They get all of this. They don't understand the biology, but they get all of the mathsy bits and the physics bits. I can't understand a word they say most of the time because they all talk in equations. But they don't understand the biological health effects because they don't have any understanding of biology. So it's a very complicated thing to get your head around. So probably the best way I can do it is to show you a few graphs. So here we have a variety of the studies that I was talking about. So we have the lifespan study. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute, which is the atomic bomb survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We have a few workers' cohorts here. We have people who were exposed from accident, the Tetra River accident and the Chernobyl accident. And we have a cohort from China in this case, which is a reasonable population to be working with, which is exposed to higher than normal background levels. This is the sort of graph that you plot to show effect here. So this is the risk of getting cancer against dose here. Okay? Now, the shape of this curve is what they call a linear no threshold, because basically you can draw a straight line through those points. Okay? But what determines the shape of that line is actually these points here. Okay? And you can see there's quite big error bars around those. That means that actually there's quite a lot of noise within there, okay? And when you look at where that data comes from, it all comes from the same cohort of people. It all comes from the lifespan cohort. And this is a pictogram of each and every person who is in that cohort, okay? You can't see it from here, but there is a single dot for each and every person with the doses calculated. And what happens when you explode an atomic bomb is you have an epicenter, and then you have a very rapid decrease of dose to people from that epicenter, from the source. It's called the inverse square law, which means if you move 10 meters away, your dose goes down by a factor of 100. Okay? So in the middle, not very many people survived. That's not because of the radiation, that's because of the blast injuries that they suffered. When you explode a bomb, there's a massive release of heat energy. And that blast killed about 120,000 people in the 2 bombings. What we are looking at here in this box is the effect on the people actually in quite a small enclosure. So less than 2 kilometers away from the epicenter of the explosion. You can see as you come out further, the doses go down. The purple ones here are about 1 millisievert, sorry. These are much higher doses in the center, sort of up to about 3. And you can see that even right in the center, a few people did survive. And they tended to be people who were actually shielded by concrete buildings and the like. You'll notice I've given you all of the references. You should be able to go and find these for yourselves if you want the detail. I don't have room on all of the slides to put everything I'd like to, so if you want to go and follow up on that, please feel free. Now, the problem that we have is actually what we really are interested in terms of doses from nuclear power plants and things like that, and medical exposures, is actually down this end of the graph. And when you expand that area of the graph, you can see how noisy this becomes. Now, obviously, if it's below the line, that's suggesting a positive health effect. And you'll have some people who talk about hormetic effects, hormesis, where they think a small amount of radiation, and there is quite good evidence for this now, a small amount of radiation can actually protect you from radiation. Okay? Sounds a bit backwards, but the data is actually starting to come now more and more for that. The problem that we have is when we talk about epidemiology studies, this is the lowest dose at which we can see an effect. So that's 0.1 sieverts. That's actually 100 millisieverts. So you'll hear that dose talked about by people. Below this, it's just too damn noisy, and we can't be sure what we're looking at. And any statistician will tell you that that could just be sampling error, maybe nothing at all. But we have a problem, because we're all exposed to background radiation of at least 100 millisieverts over our lifetime. We're all in that group. So we can't do the experiment where we take people away from all radiation on this earth, because I just can't do it. I can't find anywhere I can do that. And you wouldn't really like to be in a cave, would you? But that's the only way you could do it, is take a whole load of population away. And then, of course, if they're in a cave, they don't get natural light. There's loads of other confounders you change. So we really are stuck. And this is another teaching point that I use with children and with university students. If you have a hypothesis you can't test, don't stick a line through it. Because everybody assumes this is a straight line, but if we're honest, we haven't got a clue what's happening down here. The lower doses may be protective, we may be super sensitive to them. It looks, with more data, that it may be protective, but we really can't be 100% certain. We're certainly not more sensitive. Okay, so I promised you I'd tell you a bit more about the lifespan study. This was 86,000 people who'd survived the initial blast from the 2 A-bombs, and they were enrolled in a lifespan study, which is still continuing to this day in Japan. The results show a clear link between dose above that magic figure of 100 millisieverts and the probability of getting cancer. The average loss of life expectancy, and I was quite surprised when I saw this as well. And remember, the majority of survivors had much, much lower doses, so less than about a millisievert, which isn't even half of their annual dose on top of the background dose. The average loss of life expectancy over their entire lives is 4 months. Not really what you instinctively think about when you hear about atomic bombs. The likelihood of getting cancer from other causes is much higher than it is from radiation at the lower doses. Only 5% of all the cancers, and remember that was largely dominated by that upper numbers who had more than 2 sieverts. Only 5% of all cancers were caused by radiation. If you want more details, the latest big one here, and there's a more recent one in the Lancet, but it doesn't give you the details, okay? So what does it mean? I mean, it's great reading all these scientific papers, but actually translating them into something that you can use is usually fairly difficult. So this is taken from a beer report, which is something done in the United States. Now, I always have to say, I'm sorry I have to use Americans here. It's not that I don't like Americans, it's just that they have masses of data and big data sets, so we tend to do big health studies on the American population because we've got lots of information about their background characteristics. I'm also not sexist. There are women in here, they're just wearing trousers. Okay? So if you give 100 Americans each a dose of 100 millisieverts, how many of them do you think get, and those who were at the hypothetical, keep your hands down because you know the answer to this already, how many of them do you think get a radiation-induced cancer? Anybody like to hazard guess? Go on. Sorry? 1. Okay? So 1%. How many of them do you think get cancers from other causes? Yeah. 5? You'd be surprised. 42. All right? So as somebody who's interested in health, am I worried about a dose of 100 millisieverts? No, I'd really like to know what's causing the other 42 cancers in that group, though, because maybe that's something we could do something about that, and we'll come to that at the end of the talk. But that's really surprising. So now let's talk about Chernobyl and Fukushima. Now, this is the book that was published that you'll find lots of people cite. It's a book by Yablokov, who's a Russian author, and he concludes that 985,000 people have died after Chernobyl, mostly from cancer. There's a slight flaw in his argument, however. I can guarantee one thing to every single one of you in this room. You're all going to die. I don't know what you're going to die of, and I don't know when you're going to die, and that's what life is all about. That's the surprise in your life. Unfortunately, that is the truth, and if you take statistics that just say how many people have died, without saying, do I have a control group that were not exposed to the agent that I'm interested in as being causative, you end up with a statement like that. I'm not surprised 985,000 people have died. They're a population that is not well fed, does not look after themselves, and live a pretty tough life. Their life expectancy is about 50. So it would not be as surprising at all to me 30 years later or 20 years later when he wrote this, that a substantial number of people had died. it's probably better to go to something like this. So this is a piece by Jim Smith, who you'll hear a bit more about in a minute. And he cites a paper by Elizabeth Cardis, who's a very good radiation epidemiologist. She's now in Barcelona, not at IARC in Lyon. And she predicted that by 2065, okay, so a long way into the future, even further than we were discussing with the hypothetical on Monday, Chernobyl will have caused about 16,000 cases of thyroid cancer. Now, unfortunately, we still think cancer equals death in our minds. That's definitely not true for thyroid cancer. About 1% of those people we would expect to die from their thyroid cancer. The rest of them will go on to die from something else, because we can treat it extremely well, ironically, with high doses of iodine, rather than the low doses that we think cause these cancers. She cites that there might be 25,000 cases of other cancers. Now, that's a direct extrapolation from the LSS study, the lifespan study. Now, the radiation is quite different. This might well be true if they had had substantial amounts of gamma exposure. They haven't. They're mainly alpha and beta. So we're not actually sure whether that figure is going to pan out. And certainly, well, the data we have at the moment suggests it won't. But what is interesting is when you look at the rest of the sentence, now most of us have finished reading the sentence and haven't sort of gone past the 25,000. But you read the denominator here compared with several 100 million cancer cases. So we're looking at a very small increase of cancer compared with all the other cancers that are going to rise in that population. And it's interesting they've chosen to put the several 100 million in words without the noughts. And psychologically, you see the noughts as more dangerous. So it's interesting how we use some of the text, and I know we have at least one journalist in the audience, that perhaps conveys a slightly different meaning to what there is than we might if we conveyed it in a slightly different way. Okay, the public and nuclear accidents. Well, we get our news from the media, don't we, most of us? And this was a report that was in the Mail Online, not, I have to say, one of our better editions, earlier on this year, suggesting that, there are huge numbers of people still dying as a result of Chernobyl. That is not true. That is not what the scientific studies show. And I begin to wonder whether it's actually worthwhile our governments funding these large epidemiology studies if nobody's going to bother to take any notice of them. But unfortunately, these stories still come out. And of course, what we saw after Fukushima were these really awful headlines which caused massive fear and panic in Japan. Now, I've got to know quite a lot of the media since that happened. And I've actually sat down and said, do you know what you were doing? Why were you putting this out when there's no evidence for this whatsoever? They put it out because that's what they thought would happen. That's the information they were being given at the time. Many of them now think this was completely wrong and they shouldn't have couched their headlines in these terms, but it did sell newspapers. So I think it's quite wrong that we allow this to happen. It's interesting that in Japan at the time, the Japanese press were much more moderate in their language. That didn't actually help anybody in the end because they were having the international press say one thing, the local press say another, and the worst thing you can do to a human being is say, choose, when they don't know what to choose. And that really put an awful lot of strain on that particular population. So why are atomic bombs different from nuclear power plants? The type of radiation is very different. It's gamma from atomic bombs, which gets everywhere if it hits anything as it goes through your body. And it's alpha and beta from nuclear power plant accidents, from isotopes that are ejected from the core. Okay? So the way they get into your body is quite different. Alpha and beta, remember, you have to inhale or ingest. So you can protect people by telling them to stay indoors, just as if it was a chlorine glass cloud or something that was flying over. You can keep people indoors, so limit exposure to the air, and you can provide them with non-contaminated food. That will decrease their doses considerably. So the doses from nuclear power plant accidents are much lower than we would expect if we were looking at an atomic bomb scenario. And that's largely due to the fact that we can control access to contaminated food and air. Predominantly, actually, food. Cutting the food chain has far more effect on the dose than actually just stopping people breathing contaminated air. Probably because you expel most of the air. You breathe it in, but then you expel it again. Most of it doesn't stay in your body, whereas the food stays there for longer. So the dose to any individual can be affected by many different things. What they were doing, were they inside a building, were they outside a building? Was it a nice day? Did they have the windows and doors open? Or was it freezing cold, as it was in Japan in March 2011, and everybody was staying inside? Were the cows at pasture? Were they in the barn being fed food that had been collected before there was an exposure? So lots of things can affect the dose. As I said before, the volatile isotopes, the ones that leave the plant's immediate vicinity and spread around in the air around there, are of most concern. And the two that we really are concerned about are iodine and cesium-137. So iodine has a short physical half-life of 8 days, concentrates in the thyroid. Its biological half-life is about 100 days, so it releases its radiation while it's inside. Cesium, opposite way round, longer physical half-life, shorter biological half-life, so it doesn't tend to release its radiation when it's inside. So the doses to individual tissues are much lower from cesium than from iodine. Most people are worried about cesium because it's long-lived in the environment, because it has a longer physical half-life. Actually, what is critical here is the relationship between its physical half-life and its biological half-life. So we tend to worry about the wrong things. I'm far more worried about an iodine exposure than I am a cesium exposure. And I didn't understand that until I saw the actual doses from cesium as a result of Chernobyl. So let's look at Chernobyl and Fukushima and compare and contrast. So the thyroid doses from iodine, and remember that's the one that's going to do most damage, it's going to be concentrated in the thyroid, were 100-fold higher in Chernobyl than Fukushima. And that's simply because much, much more was released from Chernobyl than was from Fukushima. What you saw blowing up on your televisions in 2011 was the containment shell. Chernobyl didn't have a containment shell. So when the core caught fire, it released everything straight into the air, whereas most of it was contained in Fukushima. Also, the Japanese have a different diet. They're iodine replete, so their thyroid is absolutely awash with stable iodine. There isn't many places for the radioactive iodine to get into the gland. But they also, most importantly, cut that food chain as quickly as they possibly could. Now, they could have given stable iodine, and in fact, in some cases, they did give stable iodine, just to make sure that the rest of the gland was completely absorbed. If you think about it, if you have a sponge, and you put the sponge into a bucket of water, a nice dry sponge, put it into a bucket of water, and then you have a saturated sponge. If you then put it into a second bucket of water, it's not going to take up so much once it's saturated, and so that's the way it works with iodine in the thyroid. Half of the problem in Japan is, of course, they're very law-abiding and they do what they've been told. And if they've been told, please wait for a fax from the ministry before you do anything, they will wait for a fax from the ministry, despite the fact the fax isn't working because they don't have any electricity, because they've just had an earthquake and a tsunami. So there were some reasons like that. Other places actually thought, I know what to do, I'll give stable iodine. From the doses that the population had, actually it didn't matter whether they did or not, they were so low. So, if you look at the doses to people who stayed put in the Chernobyl region, because there was an evacuation, it was a bit late, but there was an evacuation after Chernobyl. If you look at the doses from cesium, and this is the bit that I couldn't understand why we didn't see any more cancers other than thyroid cancers after Chernobyl, until I saw this figure. So to about 6 million people, each individually got a dose of 9 millisieverts from the cesium, because of that long-lived physical half-life versus short-lived biological half-life. Actually, that's less than one CT scan. And I expect a lot of you in this audience have already had one CT scan by now. So why are we expecting a huge death toll when you see a number like that. You start to understand why it isn't quite how we might have thought it would be. And I'll be quite honest, I was expecting to see a lot more cancers following Chernobyl, because I was quite anti-nuclear till I started working on Chernobyl. Then I saw the figures and saw the facts coming out, and I thought, I can't sustain this. I need to think about this again. If we look at Fukushima, it's even less. So the actual doses to about 93% of the population, and there's a very sharp tail off, so virtually nobody got more than about 13 millisieverts in total, I think. The actual doses were less than a millisievert. That's less than half of their annual dose they would expect us to receive from background. Bit surprising, it's not what you really expect to see. And that was all within the first 4 months, and then they thought, right, we'd better monitor the rest of it by whole body counting to see if it's, maybe we've got this wrong, it's very, very low. And they took whole body counts at later time points and showed the majority of people have no detectable cesium whatsoever in their body. And that's simply because they're following the guidelines. They're not eating contaminated food. They did have, and I never thought I'd say this about the Japanese, but there were some people who did not follow the regulations. And they decided they would, bugger this, I'm just getting in my boat and I'm going to go and fish for my own fish, or I'm going to get it from my friend down the road who's been out. And so they were eating locally produced fish and locally produced green produce. And when they were questioned as to why, they were only just registering. What have you done differently? Oh, well, I didn't think it would matter. So they said, look, do us a favour. Will you just go home and follow the rules for 3 months and come back and we'll rescan you? And when they rescanned them, of course, there was no detectable cesium. So it was a nice proof that actually by following the regulations about restricting food intake, they actually reduced their doses. Although at the doses that they were detected with, it was insignificant anyway. It just shows that actually you can bear the science out with a bit of study as well afterwards. Now, this is the real facts about Chernobyl. Not what you necessarily would read in the media, but there were 28 deaths in the people, the first responders, the firemen, who tried to put out the fire from acute radiation syndrome. Actually, 134 people got doses of over a sievert each, and that's the level at which we start to see this acute radiation syndrome. 14 of those people have gone on and had children, and their children are absolutely fine. And I should have said before that the lifespan studies show absolutely no effect in the second generation. But 28 of them did actually die from acute radiation syndrome. Now, medicine wasn't quite as advanced then, and in fact, we actually have a way now of supporting the bone marrow, which was actually trialled in this population who had huge doses of radiation. We now use that all the time when we give patients chemotherapy. So even from something like Chernobyl, we actually have had something quite positive for the rest of us that's come out of it. There have been 15 deaths from thyroid cancer in 25 years. As I said, we would expect to see about a death rate of 1% overall. So if we have 16,000 thyroid cancer cases, we'd expect a death of about 160 people. But that will be several years after their initial diagnosis. I've put in brackets no scientific evidence. There's a hell of a lot of crap out there, but there is no scientific evidence of increased thyroid cancers outside the three republics. We'll talk a bit more about thyroid cancer in Fukushima in a minute. No effect on fertility, malformations or infant mortality. Now, we have to say there's no conclusion on adverse pregnancy outcomes because we don't have the data. You have to remember that when Chernobyl happened, it was in Soviet Russia, and we didn't get the early data on the first 6 months we'd need to have had it on after the accident. They were still finally owning up to it. And so to see adverse pregnancy outcomes, we'd need that very early data. And in fact, people don't want to talk about it either. So it's quite difficult to get that data. But at the doses that we now know, it's just impossible to conceive they would have been. Heritable effects not seen, and extremely, even in those who had acute radiation syndromes, who had very high doses, and very unlikely at the doses of the general population. Interestingly, there are some reports coming out that are starting to suggest there might be an increase in leukemia in the liquidated cohorts. Now, the liquidators were the people who actually cleaned up the mess, so they got a variety of different doses depending on when they were on duty at the reactor. It's actually quite difficult to be certain that that is genuine. It's surprising because normally we will get an increase in leukemias from radiation exposure within 10 to 15 years, and we're now looking at 30 years plus. It's also a type of leukemia that we don't have any evidence for in any other cohort that is actually affected by radiation. So there are other confounders that they might have been exposed to. A lot of cleaning agents that contain benzene and things like that might have been used as well, which might have also increased their CLL, their particular type of leukemia. But the jury is still out on that. But at the doses of over 100 millisieverts, we might see something, but we don't think we're going to see an awful lot. So the health effects of Fukushima are quite different because the doses were much lower. So there have been no radiation-related deaths. The doses to the workers at the plant were far, far lower. You know, talking of 100,000-fold lower than the ones that gave acute radiation syndrome. And some of those who had acute radiation syndrome are still alive today, by the way. There's one guy who had 8 sieverts, who they reckon the reason he's still alive is because he is built extremely strong. He is your typical Russian fighter. He's all muscle, and they think his muscle protected him. But in Fukushima, we didn't have doses anything like that. But there was about 1,500 deaths from the knee-jerk evacuation, and this is where I think we have to start getting our heads around this. People panicked because it was radiation. Some people from, old people care homes, from hospitals, were piled onto buses with no medical help. The doctors had run away because they were scared. No medical help, no water, no food, on a bus for 24 hours, because the roads, as you can imagine, were a total nightmare. When they opened those buses, they could smell people had died. Now, there is no excuse in a civilized society for allowing us to do things like that, but people panicked because it was radiation. We have to look at the guidance for emergency measures, because that could never be allowed to happen again. The Japanese have been quite honest about that, and they are now sort of saying, we need to look at this. This is not right, especially when you're looking at low doses. And of course, what we all forget is the 20,000 deaths in the tsunami. It was a huge death toll. I can't imagine that happening anywhere else. Very difficult to imagine that happening in the UK, and I suspect in Australia too. It's unlikely there will be any increase in thyroid cancer. As a scientist, we're not supposed to say there won't be. There will not be an increase in thyroid cancer because the doses were so low and the population was so small. But the psychological harm that was caused during the evacuation and radiophobia, people being made to fear that there was a nasty big cancer coming down the tracks at them, is not to be trivialized. It was a massive problem. And it was exactly the same problem that was highlighted in the WHO report, the UNSCEAR report on the effects of the Chernobyl accident, which we finished in 2008, but because of politics, took until 2011 to get it published. We said the same thing then. Actually, the radiation from Chernobyl didn't do the damage. The fear of the radiation has caused huge psychological problems there. And there's a massive economic effect on the local area. Now, Fukushima Prefecture is a very big prefecture. There are areas of it that had absolutely no radiation whatsoever. But as soon as you say the word Fukushima, people will go, can't eat the food from there, which is rubbish. The food is not contaminated. But unfortunately, when you have a label like that, it's very difficult to shift. And there are still people today in Japan who will not eat, and the Chinese and I think the Koreans will not import it either. So, just because we're frightened of it, not because of any decent scientific reason, this is having major effects on Japan today. Never mind the fact that they had to shut down all the power stations as well, and import oil and all the rest of it, which is expensive. Okay, let's look at thyroid cancer. Because I can see some of you going, hang on, what about all the thyroid cancers? You glossed over that. Well, let's look at that data now. So the first thing the Japanese did was said, we want to look after our people. We will devise a very comprehensive health survey, which is costing them a fortune to do, that will monitor this population so that we can give them confidence that their health will not be affected. I think actually it's had the opposite effect on people. Most people have thought, well, if they're doing this health survey, putting all this money into it, they must be looking for something. We are all doomed. So I don't think psychologically that was necessarily the right thing to do. The trouble is that all of these health surveys produce huge amounts of data. And if nobody interprets it for the media or for non-specialist scientists, it's going to get misinterpreted. And that's exactly what's starting to happen. And the Japanese academics who spoke up after Fukushima and tried to say, look, the evidence that we have is that this is not going to be what you all think it is, were shot down by the press. They were pilloried by the press. One of my personal friends was likened to Goebbels. It's been very unpleasant for them. So they're all hiding now, and they don't want to go through that again. They think it'll damage their career. And of course, in Japan, how other people perceive you is an extremely important cultural thing. Less so in the UK, as evidenced by most of our politicians. But you see these headlines. Thyroid cancer in Fukushima, cancer rates increasing near kids near Fukushima. Now, are these true or not? Well, how you look matters. We're all au fait in our own cultures with screening programs for cancer, and the whole idea of that is to find smaller lumps earlier, okay? So you treat the patient quicker. Now, it's a bit of a problem when you look with thyroid cancer. If you do it the old way and stand behind your patient and put your fingers just there and feel the thyroid, you will detect about 2.6% of bumps. So 2.6% of people will have a bump in their thyroid if you do it that way. I can see you all going like that now. You need somebody to stand behind you. Okay? But they're doing this a much more scientific way. But unfortunately, that means it pushes up the incidence of finding lumps to 19 to 35%, depending on the type of ultrasound you're using. Because the thyroid, like probably quite a few things in the body, actually produces very small tumours that sit there and do nothing. And we're starting to find that there is a problem now with kidney cancer, because lots of older people are reporting to hospitals, nothing to do with Fukushima now. Older people are reporting to hospitals and go, oh, I don't feel very well, I'm finding it a bit difficult to digest my food. So you get bunged in a contrast CT scanner with your dose of radiation, and they go, you've got a lump on your kidney. Now, we suspect that lump on your kidney is probably never going to kill you. That lump on your kidney is something that happens with aging. We just haven't been looking for it in the past and doing the tests. So we're now starting to operate on people because as soon as a lump is found, you want it out, which means quite a lot of people are wandering around now with only one kidney in their old age, which is not necessarily good for them. But that just shows you that how you look really does matter when you're looking at the incidence of cancer. And sometimes it's better not to know. And of course, if you do a post-mortem study, you can take the whole thyroid out and slice it very thinly, and you can find the tumours that only compose one follicle of the thyroid. So tiny, 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 weeny things. And then your incidence goes up to about 65%, depending on how thinly you slice the thyroid. So I can say that probably half of you have probably got a lump in your thyroid that you're blissfully unaware of. It's not going to kill you, it's not going to do anything, and you will die with it and be blissfully unaware of it. That's just life, I'm afraid. And the more we do with postmortems, the more we do of finding these tumours, the more frequencies we're going to find of this. Because as you get older, you will get a number of tumours appearing in your body. The problem with thyroid cancer is it doesn't have a normal growth curve. Normally, the operative statistics go up slowly with time as you get older in the population. Now, that's true for the men, but for females, for some reason we don't understand, we peak somewhere around about the menopause level. Okay, and this is true for a variety of different populations. This is the Japanese figures. So the men get there in the end, as they always do. So that's your normal curve, taken from operative statistics. When you screen the population, you shift that curve to the left. Okay? So the incidence of that bump will now appear in that box, which is exactly where we're screening. So what we're doing is we're finding cancers that were in the population anyway that we wouldn't be looking for or wouldn't become clinically apparent, sometimes never, sometimes as you got older. So unfortunately, what you're seeing is an artifact of the screening, nothing to do with the radiation. And there is another paper that has now looked at a smaller number, admittedly, but other populations in Japan, and actually show the incidence of nodules is higher and the incidence of cancer is higher in those populations than it is Fukushima. But to do 2 health surveys on the scale they're doing it was prohibitively expensive. And having talked to some of the women who've put their children through this, I said, I don't want anybody else to ever go through this. This is horrible. So actually, it's probably just as well they haven't done a control arm to this study as well. So, the scientific studies indicate that the measures put in place by the Japanese authorities have led to extremely low doses of radiation. These doses, there'll be no discernible effect on health of the radiation. We can say that because of all the data that we do have. But the societal dislocation and stress that have been caused by that prolonged evacuation, it is the prolonged evacuation that's probably caused more problems than anything else, is going to have an effect on psychological health. And if the Japanese are quick, they can get in there to mitigate those effects. They're encouraging people to exercise more because the whole of their daily life has been disrupted. So they don't exercise, so they put on weight. They have heart problems. They don't have the benefits of being outside because they're scared about the radiation. So they're putting things in place now to try and mitigate some of that. Some sections of the population, however, still believe they're going to die from acute radiation syndrome, despite the fact that the doses they got were 1,000th of that at the lowest end that's going to cause it, but they still believe it. So the communication is not going well. The only way that we can counteract this is to get the scientists and the media to work together to dispel some of these myths that surround the effects of low doses of radiation on health. Or the opinions of the pseudoscientists are going to prevail and cause yet more damage. So how do we do that? Well, one of the ways to deal with this is to make it visible. Radiation, you can't smell it, you can't taste it, you can't hear it. Probably a good reason for that, because if we're all exposed to it all the time, it would be like having tinnitus in your ear the whole time if you could detect it. So that might be why pure conjecture, but it might be why we can't see it or smell it. So they've given people dosimeters, and this is a study they did with school children, just to help them come to terms with what was going on. And they chose one school in France that was in Corsica. Now, Corsica has a high background radiation level than the rest of France. So they should show quite nicely that variation, which is why that middle one is very variable. But here you are, outside and inside of Fukushima, around about the same, Belarus and Poland as well. So the children were able to look at that and think, okay, it's not as bad as we think it might be. Being in Fukushima is not necessarily going to be bad for me. And they published it. And all of the children who took part in that have got their names on a scientific paper, so they're very happy with that. Now, this is the trace of the French students. And this perhaps will put some context on what the doses are that they get exposed to. So they started off in Paris, they went to Tokyo for a while, and then they went to Fukushima Prefecture. Any idea what you think that first blip might be? The first blip's actually security at Charles de Gaulle. That's the flight, which is off the scale. Okay? To give you an idea, every time I go back and forth for Japan, I get about 0.14 millisieverts, okay? Which is just about 5% of my dose. A fifth of my dose, an annual dose. And I've been 4 times this year. What do you think that one just there might be? They're in Tokyo now. Only a few of them have gone through this. Not everybody went on it. Yeah? Sorry? No, that's actually the embassy security system. Okay? So it's worse than going through Charles de Gaulle. I'm not sure the French embassy have seen this one yet. Now, they then moved north, and they went to Iwaki. Let me just get those on. And here's Iwaki, which is south of the plant. What do you think this is? That's Tomioka, I've told you now. Tomioka is one of the towns that is immediately south of the plant, okay? So it's right on the edge of the exclusion zone, not actually in the exclusion zone. And you see that's minuscule compared with their flight. So why are we worrying so much about what's going on here when we've got this problem? And in fact, somebody said at the meeting I've just been at that the 1 millisievert dose that the Japanese are aiming for before they move people back, actually if you stand on the steps of your parliament building, you will get a dose for all year, you will get a dose that's higher than that. So maybe that puts it into some perspective. He didn't say how much higher than that, but never mind. Okay, so another way to look at it is how do we compare different health risks? And we get our heads around this a bit better by doing it this way. So if we look at living in a megacity like London versus Inverness. Inverness is lovely, no jobs. London is horrible, lots of jobs. Very stressful. Passive smoking, not even if you smoke yourself, but if you live with somebody who smokes. Okay? and you look at the people who are exposed as a part of clearing up from the Chernobyl accident, what do you think is probably worst for your health? Interesting, a lot of people say that. It's actually living in London compared with Inverness because of the particulates that you get in the atmosphere in London and the stress of living in London. So it's actually, don't go to London, stay in Adelaide. It'd be much better for you. I'm looking at Inverness, but unfortunately don't have many university jobs up there. Passive smoking is actually next. So actually not just living with somebody who smokes rather than actually smoking yourself is actually better than living in London compared with Inverness, but not hugely better. So those of you who are smoking, what do you have to do? Stop. Then if you look at the higher dose of liquidators, they have a 1% increased mortality, so lower than if they live with somebody who smokes. And as you go down, obviously, the detriment decreases. So why do we think this is so dangerous? Okay, well, let's look at something else. Let's look at something that we're all smoking again, I'm afraid. It's one of those things that's easy to quantify. Lifetime smoker, male doctor, usually a cardiologist in my experience, they tend to be the worst. He loses about 10 years of his life through smoking. Now, sadly, the next one is a bit close to home. Somebody who has a bigger than normal BMI and is in the severely obese category. I'm nearly as bad as if I smoke. I used to lose 10 years of my life because I'm fat. I've enjoyed my life very much, thank you very much, but I am not doing myself any favours, although my children will probably be happier if I don't live too long. The interesting thing is that if you were an atomic bomb survivor, right, so you've had a lot higher doses than we're talking about with Chernobyl or Fukushima, who was in the most exposed group, inside that circle that I showed you on the diagram, so about 1.5 kilometres from the hypercentre, and you were shielded to a certain extent, so you weren't killed because of the blast and very high radiation. So your dose is about 2.6 sieverts. Sorry, your dose is about 2 sieverts, which is high. It will give you acute radiation syndrome. You only lose 2.6 years of your life. So if you were a survivor, closest to the bomb when it went off, it's better for you than being fat. That rather turns things on its head, doesn't it? So, of course, remember, those who are from nuclear accidents are much, much lower than the atomic bombs. So we're not going to see anything like that, average years of lost life. Okay, we have to remember that life is a balancing act. We have to get how we produce energy right. We have to get it balanced. Otherwise, we're going to be in real problems. And I think we've now got to this area that we're actually considering every potential risk and focusing on a risk that is actually quite small. And we're ignoring all the other risks we're creating behind it. So we're actually making those risks worse. And a good example of that is if you look at the health effects of different ways of producing energy. Nothing is risk-free, number one. Nothing in life is risk-free. We all like to think it is, but it's not. Everything is risky. Getting on the plane to go to Tokyo tomorrow is risky. It could fall out of the sky. It is a risk, and we have to believe that everything has got a risk to it, although we don't want to get focused on it, because then life will not be fun. So if you look at the different ways of producing energy, and let's just look at coal and nuclear here. Now, coal produces an awful lot of particulates. Particulates enter into your lungs, cause lung problems. They also get through your lungs and cause cardiovascular problems too. And if you look here, you can see that the number of deaths and serious illnesses, never mind the minor illnesses, is huge if we produce our power from coal. Never mind climate change, this is just the particulate problems. But if you look at nuclear, it's considerably less. Okay, this was before the accidents, but the accidents will not have changed these figures. Fukushima accident won't have changed the figures. Now, as soon as I show that slide, people say, well, you're giving this pro-nuclear argument. I'm not. I'm just showing you facts. And these aren't even my facts. This is in the Lancet. This is a good paper that's looked at all of this. And it's interesting that the country in Europe that has most respiratory problems is Germany. And Germany is about to give up its nuclear power and go back to coal. It'll be slightly cleaner coal than this is on that side, but it's still bad. And also, remember, it also increases the amount of radiation threefold over a nuclear power plant as well. Not that that's going to have any effect on your health. But it's interesting the logic we use to look at all of this. So let's look again at worldwide deaths and compare them with what's happened from the nuclear accidents. So if you look at residential radon, which is the stuff that comes up from the ground, very nice in Cornwall, good for you. That's what I have to say to the Cornish Tourist Agency. It actually causes 99,000 deaths worldwide each year, okay? We do have protection measures against radon. Every country that has that problem has protection measures, so they are decreasing. But it still causes 99,000 deaths each year. If you look at particulate emissions, particularly the small particulates that are present from diesel cars, from burning fossil fuels, etc., 3,200,000 deaths each year worldwide. I look at smoking. Again, I'm sorry if there's any smokers in the audience. You are having a bad time tonight, but you should know better. You're looking at 6,300,000 deaths per year from smoking. Not just lung cancer deaths, all the cardiovascular problems as well. Nuclear accidents. Now, it will depend on whether you believe Elizabeth Cardis's figures of 25,000 extra deaths worldwide because of the accident, or whether you think those won't happen. But it's somewhere between 200 and 25,200. And we will have to wait and see exactly where it is, but I suspect it will be to the lower end of that figure. Now, that's not per year. That's total deaths. The figures at the top of there are per year. So why are we so frightened about this stuff? Have we really got the wrong end of the stick here? I think we probably have. But we're going to have to get our heads around this. Otherwise, we're going to create more problems for more people. And I haven't included anything about climate change in there. And climate changes will affect the more vulnerable people in our population much more. The older people can't tolerate heat as well as younger people. And never mind the flooding, etc., that may have been caused recently by climate change. So this is just particulates, not that as well. So the health effects of radiation-related dose. Individual doses from accidents are much, much lower than we think they are. We need to get our heads around that quickly. An energy mix that favours nuclear and renewables. You can tell I'm from the UK, and we've just said we are going to finally build our new nuclear power stations. It's just taken us a very long while to get there because of all the myths that surround radiation and health. But if we do get that energy mix better, in Australia you might be able to use solar and wind. It doesn't sunshine that often in the UK, particularly in the winter. It's going to reduce the health consequences of particulate emissions and climate change. If we want a modern society, we've got to generate energy. Can you imagine not having your children staring at their phones all the time? You'd have to talk to them. We need energy, and we're not actually saving energy because we're finding better ways of using it now. So we are going to have to get our heads around this. But we should use scientific facts rather than urban myths to decide our future energy policy. Otherwise, future generations are going to look back on us and think, God, how thick were they? Could they not see this is all wrong? So somebody asked me at the hypothetical what Chernobyl was like today. Well, here's some pictures for you. Chernobyl is now a wildlife preserve because man is no longer there. So the big predators, well, they're a very rare breed of horse. And you've got wolves, you've got wild boar. You can actually go there and have a tour around the area for the purposes of looking at the nature now. And if you want to read the article, there's the thing to the article. This is actually available in Australia. I checked before I put it up there. Nick Ross, who's one of our best investigative journalists in the UK, did a programme to mark the 25th anniversary of Chernobyl. Ironically, it was on a month after Fukushima, but we weren't exactly thinking it was going to work out like that. That's a really good programme to go and listen to, and you can get that on the iPlayer here. And if you really want to understand how politics has entered in and smudged the science and all of this, look at Pandora's Promise. You can get it from iTunes. And this actually takes you through how many people in the States have looked at the facts now and have changed their opinion about nuclear and its effects on health, and tried to weigh up the risks and the benefits between climate change, and using nuclear as part of our baseload. It's quite an interesting program, and it also shows you that we may not have had the 2 accidents we had if the government in the States had not changed and closed down a research program that had designed a reactor that, when it overheated, stopped itself. And it just shows you how much politics comes into the mix when you're talking about science. I think we should have more scientists who are politicians, but I'm not entirely sure that they turn out to be that good, as Maggie Thatcher was a chemist. But never mind. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Gerry. I'll just put the advert in right at the start. So Gerry is part of our nuclear working group at UCL Australia, and that's a group that we brought together using expertise at UCL, University of South Australia, Flinders University, Oxford, and even Imperial, that we brought together to...
dangerous.
That's right, given that we're such rivals. We brought that together to do exactly what we have done today, and that's to provide some facts and scientific information, given the debate we're having here in South Australia at the moment. Now, I'm going to kick off with the question, because I'm going to, that's my privilege. One of the questions I guess I've got in terms of the relatively large exclusion zones that happen after an accident like Fukushima, is that based on just the uncertainty in terms of the risk of low dose, or also about just how big the dose might be, in terms of how big the accident might be?
It's basically adhering to international guidelines, which there is now quite a lot of pressure on that people should look at. If you read the guidelines, you actually don't have to evacuate under certain emergency conditions, and the argument is where you place that evacuation level. And the meeting I've just come from was having a lot of discussions about where should we place that level. Should we really make it as draconian as it is, when we have the information that suggests that below 100 millisieverts is not as bad as we think it is? I accept, you may have to look at different doses for children and adults as well. But the Japanese are trying to get it down virtually to half of background before they let people back in, so a dose of 1 millisievert, whereas actually 20 millisieverts would be absolutely fine. And they have a problem because they keep talking about, well, if we get it lower, it's safer. So nobody wants to move back, because unless you get it to nothing, it's safer. Nothing is not possible. And that's the problem with that LMT curve, is that it can't go through 0 because we're all exposed to radiation. So there's a lot of controversy about it. And I think we're getting to the stage where we actually need to say, what are the consequences of setting this dose? Is that going to disrupt society so much that we get people dying in the evacuation routes because everybody's so scared? Or should we be looking at this another way? And that dose may take you a year or 10 years to get to. In fact, the calculations suggest that now we do have the information about what was released, that if you had done nothing to the Fukushima area, left it as it was, and people had gone about their daily lives, you have to repair the earthquake damage as well, because it's a bit of a problem, because it was a triple disaster from that point of view, because you had the earthquake and the tsunami, so somebody had to go and clear up, and you couldn't just let people go back to the houses as they were. But if you were to let them back in, their doses would cause less deaths to that population than the evacuation measures that were put in.
Okay, we'll open it up to questions. There's one up the back there. There's a microphone there if you like. Sorry.
Could you comment on the fact that childhood leukemia was almost unknown before the above-ground tests?
That's not true. Childhood leukemia has always been known. It is not new to the above-ground tests. The medical literature will tell you that's something different.
I didn't say that it was unknown. I said that it was almost unknown. So the quantities and numbers of children
that's just diagnostic improvement. The number of breast cancer is increasing all the time simply because we're diagnosing better now.
Okay, and could you comment on why it is that governments who promote nuclear energy are mostly interested in getting their nice little piles of plutonium so that they can become nuclear weapons states?
That is history. There's another good program that, if you can find it, I think it's available online. It's a Horizon program done by Jill Al-Khalili, who actually is a professor of physics down on the south coast of the UK, who actually looked at why did we use uranium rather than thorium as our source. If we'd gone with the science, we would have used thorium. We used uranium at the time the decisions were taken. I don't think those decisions will be taken the same way now, because you're right, because there was plutonium. But those decisions were taken in the early 60s. Thorium is a far better source of energy, and we'd have had a very different fleet of nuclear reactors had we gone down that route. That, I'm afraid, is politics interfering in the science.
And could you, after all, comment on the brilliance of the scientists who produced nuclear power that has gigantic accidents?
It does not have gigantic accidents. It has accidents. We make them into problems because of our reaction to them. It's had 2. How many people do you think have died as a... Hang on. You have to generate energy somehow. How many people do you think have died as a result of coal mining, then using coal-fired power stations? You saw the figures there for deaths from burning coal in coal-fired power stations. You cannot pick on one energy source and use it in exclusion. You have to look at the balance. And the answer is not that many people have died from nuclear accidents from power plants.
Thank you. I grew up in the UK, near Windscale, Sellafield, in fact, and in 1957 there was a significant accident there where one of the reactors caught fire. Has any studies actually been done on that accident?
There have been studies done on them, but the releases were not huge. Yeah. We know that much. Yeah. Part of the problem with doing those studies is our population moves an awful lot, and the studies weren't put in place. It was before people, I think, realised that there was a consequence to this and they should be doing these studies. But they have been done, and there's nothing really to see. And that's part of the problem we have. If you have negative results, it's very difficult to get them published in the scientific press.
I do remember, in fact, that they threw the milk away from the county for about 6 months afterwards. Well,
we've only just taken off the restrictions of sheep in North Wales from the Chernobyl accident, not because it's dangerous, and that is another real problem we have this. When you bring in compensation to people, they keep the need for compensation going longer than it's scientifically justified for. And, you know, everybody admits that there was no need to stop the sheep in Wales from going into the food chain, but the farmers weren't willing to lose the subsidy. So again, it's the politics and the actions that we take that actually perhaps misinform us about the real risks.
Okay.
Thank you. I also, from England, I grew up living about 5 kilometres from Aldermaston, where they were making bombs, of course. But my question isn't about that. I mean, the big issue for us in South Australia is, of course, the waste repository, and I wonder whether you could just comment on the sort of likelihood of radiation from that and the sort of risks to people working in a possible industry of that kind in this state. I know it's a big question, but...
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a different thing disposing radioactive waste than doing it as a nuclear power plant. This waste is going to be vitrified, and if I can find Sammy knows an awful lot about where is he? Over there. Sammy knows an awful lot about the Finnish repository. Perhaps he can come in and comment on that. The way the waste is handled is it's vitrified, and the best way to try and explain this to you is why it won't leak out, is if you imagine a green bottle, when you smash the bottle, the green dye doesn't leak, does it? And that's what they're doing with that waste. They're encasing it in such a way that it will not leach out from there. It's going to be deep underground. Most of these things are alpha emitters, so it doesn't get through a piece of paper, never mind anything else. So it's not going to come up and get you. It won't leach out from where they deposit it, and it's your decision as to whether you want to have a geological disposal facility like that in Australia. I think you're very brave to be having that discussion, because obviously this polarizes people. But I actually think it's great to actually see people engaging in that conversation. But to me, there's far less problem from a geological disposal facility like that than from a nuclear power plant or anything similar to that.
We want those as well.
Oh, you may not need them down here. You have to look carefully. Do you really need them?
Yes, tell the Commissioner.
Do you have any information on the results of the nuclear tests that were run in South Australia?
I don't personally have that data because it's not something that I've looked into, but I have met some of the nuclear test veterans from Maralinga who are British, and I know some of them are very worried about potential health effects. But I hope that you can see from the picture that I showed you with the concentric rings, the dose that most people will have received from those tests is absolutely minuscule, because most of them were several kilometres away from that blast. So the doses they receive from the tests are minimal.
We might draw this evening to a close, but I'd like to thank Gerry for her talk this evening and thank everyone for coming along.